Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The morning light over Red Mesa was flat and dry, the kind that revealed every crack in the wooden storefronts and every strip of dust on the ground. Elias Ward rode in at a steady pace, his shoulders tight beneath a faded coat. He scanned the street without shifting his head much, taking in the movement of people, the sound of boots on planks, and the occasional glance sent his way. He never liked new towns, and his body showed it. His posture stayed guarded, and his breathing came slow. Elias had been riding for 3 days, sleeping in short intervals, waking at every noise. He had no long-term destination. His only plan was simple: stay alive, keep moving, and avoid the kind of trouble that had followed him in the past. Years earlier, a failed attempt to protect a family during a ranch skirmish had left him with 2 graves behind him and a habit of silence. He drifted from town to town because staying anywhere too long brought questions he didn't want to answer. Today, his purpose in Red Mesa was plain. He needed tools, ammunition, and a few bags of flour and beans. Nothing more. He didn't intend to stay longer than a few hours. Near the general store, he dismounted, tied his horse, and let himself observe the street again. His eyes halted when he noticed a woman holding a shawl tightly around her shoulders. She stood near a basket she had set on the wooden walkway. Her dark hair fell loosely, and she kept her head angled down, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. The tension in her posture made Elias pause. He had seen fear like that before. Fear of being watched, judged, or harmed. The woman's right hand shook as she reached for the basket. Her breath hitched in a way that made her chest rise sharply. Something wasn't right. Her name, though Elias didn't know it yet, was Mara, an Apache widow who had come into town early to buy supplies before the crowds formed. She had hoped to avoid attention. The bruising on her shoulder, hidden beneath the shawl, throbbed each time she moved. She hadn't slept well after what had happened the previous night. The ranch foreman who attacked her had warned her not to speak, and she believed him. When she stepped outside that morning, her stomach had clenched, but she had no other choice. She had to eat, and she had nowhere else to go. She felt the weight of the town's distrust. Red Mesa tolerated her presence, but did not welcome her. People blamed the hardships of the region on anything foreign, and an Apache widow living alone made for an easy target. Elias watched her struggle with the basket. He didn't approach immediately. He always hesitated before stepping into someone else's problem. Experience taught him that doing so often created more trouble than it solved. But he also felt the familiar tug of empathy he could never fully resist. The more he looked at her, the more he sensed something fragile behind her stillness. He stepped closer. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "You need help with that?" Mara's shoulders tightened. She shifted slightly, but didn't look at him. The bruises burned under the cloth, and her voice barely held steady. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't. Elias could hear the strain in her tone, controlled but thin. He didn't push. Instead, he picked up the fallen cloth from the edge of her basket and handed it to her. Their eyes met for the first time. Her gaze carried fear, exhaustion, and something else, caution sharpened over years of surviving without support. He nodded once and stepped back, giving her space. Mara felt a faint relief in that gesture. Not safety, but the recognition of someone who wasn't a threat. She didn't trust him, but she didn't flinch from him either, which surprised her. As he turned toward the general store, she let out a shaky breath. Her ribs hurt, her legs felt weak, and she wished she could disappear before the foreman found her again. But she forced herself to continue. She had already made the mistake of looking afraid the night before, and fear had cost her dearly. Elias stepped inside the store, but his thoughts stayed on the woman outside. He didn't plan to get involved. He reminded himself of that clearly. His mission was straightforward: get supplies and leave. No attachments, no complications. That was how he survived these past years. Still, something in her expression stayed with him. It wasn't only fear, it was the weight of someone carrying too many losses with no one left to share them. He recognized that look because he wore it himself. When he finished buying what he needed and walked back outside, he found her again, this time standing at the edge of the walkway, watching the road as if expecting trouble. Her knuckles pressed hard against the strap of her basket. Elias paused before mounting his horse. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he had a feeling, one he could not shake, that whatever brought him to Red Mesa today was more than supplies. Mara kept her basket close to her chest as she walked toward the end of the walkway, trying to decide whether to hurry home or circle around town to avoid the ranch foreman altogether. Her breathing grew uneven each time she looked down the street. She needed to stay alert, but her thoughts kept drifting to the pain in her shoulder and the sharp sting across her ribs. She tightened her shawl, hoping no one would notice how carefully she moved. She had not slept enough to think clearly. The night had been spent listening for footsteps outside her small shelter, expecting the foreman to return. The thought of running crossed her mind more than once, but she had no family left, no safe place to ride to, and no one willing to take her in. Staying alive meant finding food, keeping distance from danger, and never letting anyone see weakness. A group of townspeople passed her, whispering to each other. She didn't catch the words, but she understood the tone, wary, disapproving, tired of her presence. Her pulse sharpened. She lowered her gaze and stepped toward the corner of the street, hoping the unease in her stomach would settle long enough for her to reach the road leading out of town. Elias stepped out of the general store, carrying a small sack of supplies. He stopped when he saw her standing still at the corner, her posture rigid, one hand pressed to her side as if holding herself together. He noticed how she scanned the street, not with curiosity, but with a controlled fear of someone waiting for trouble. He also noticed how the townsfolk avoided her, giving her more space than they offered anyone else. He didn't understand the full story, but the bruises beneath the shawl, her shaking hands, and the way she braced for each sound filled in more than enough of the missing pieces. Mara took one step toward the road. A voice behind her made her freeze. "There you are." The foreman approached with quick, confident strides. The tone of his voice made Elias lift his head immediately. Mara's body went still, her breath caught halfway, and her fingers tightened around the basket until her knuckles paled. The foreman stopped beside her, close enough that she had to angle away from him. "Thought you'd run off," he said, lowering his voice but letting enough sharpness bite through. "We're not done talking." Mara didn't answer. She stared at the ground, hoping silence would keep him from escalating. Her heart thudded painfully, and she swallowed hard, trying to control the panic rising in her chest. She didn't want to draw attention. She didn't want the street to watch again. But she also knew she couldn't escape him alone. Elias took a few steps toward them, his boots striking the dirt with slow, deliberate rhythm. He didn't call out or make a show of intervening. He simply watched the foreman's grip closing around Mara's arm, and the way she pulled back slightly, her voice silent, but her fear clear. The foreman leaned closer to her. "Don't make a scene," he muttered. Mara whispered, barely audible, "Let go." He didn't. Instead, he tightened his grip. She winced, and the sound was enough to unsettle Elias's calm. He acted before thinking further. He reached the pair and stopped at Mara's side, placing himself just one step between her and the foreman. Elias kept his stance straight and steady, not threatening, not timid, simply immovable. "That's enough," he said quietly. The foreman looked him over, annoyed at the interruption. "This isn't your business." Elias didn't respond. His eyes lowered to the man's hand on Mara's arm, and that was all he needed to convey his point. The foreman held his grip for one more stubborn second before Elias's silence forced him to reconsider. Mara felt the pressure release as the hand slid away. She didn't lift her head. She focused on keeping her balance and trying not to shake. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the foreman said, trying to regain control of the situation. Elias finally met his eyes. "Walk away." Something in the cowboy's tone, quiet, certain, unshaken, made the foreman pause. He scowled but stepped back, frustrated at being challenged in front of witnesses. He muttered something under his breath before turning and heading toward the saloon. Mara let out a slow breath she had been holding too long. The sudden release left her dizzy. She opened her mouth as if to thank Elias, but the words got stuck. Speaking felt too heavy right now. Elias glanced around them. making sure no one else intended to approach. He noticed the bruising along the edge of her collarbone where the shawl had shifted. The mark was deep, the kind left by someone who didn't know restraint or didn't care. He lowered his voice. "You're hurt." Mara shook her head quickly. "I can manage." But her posture, the way she leaned slightly to one side, and the tension in her arms told him otherwise. "You shouldn't be alone right now," he said. She didn't deny it. She also didn't agree. Her thoughts ran too fast. Fear of dragging someone innocent into her trouble, fear of being judged, fear of appearing weak again. But Elias wasn't pushing her, and he didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. That steadiness settled something in her, even if only for a moment. He gestured toward a quiet back street beside the livery stable. "Come this way. People won't bother you there." Mara hesitated. Trust had cost her before, but staying here meant inviting the foreman back the moment he built up more courage or anger. Her ribs throbbed with each breath, and she couldn't carry the basket much longer. She gave a small nod. Elias took the lead, walking with a slow pace so she wouldn't fall behind. Mara followed, gripping her shawl tightly, hoping the small shift towards safety would hold long enough for her fear to settle. The townsfolk watched but said nothing, their silence heavy and familiar. Behind them, the main street returned to its usual noise, unaware that the small choices made in that moment were already changing the course of two lives. The narrow path beside the livery stable was quiet, shielded from the main street by stacked crates, a water trough, and the stable wall. Mara stopped beneath the shade, pressing one hand to her ribs as the movement of walking caught up with her. She tried to hide the strain, but the pain made her shoulders tremble. Elias stood a short distance away, giving her room. He scanned the street behind them, making sure the foreman hadn't followed. When he saw no one approaching, he let his guard drop slightly, though not completely. He had been in enough confrontations to know that trouble sometimes arrived late, not early. Mara kept her gaze fixed on the ground. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. She needed safety, but she didn't want to be seen as someone who depended on a stranger. She wanted to leave town, but the road ahead felt too exposed. She feared the foreman, yet she feared the eyes of the townspeople almost as much. Every direction carried risk. Elias noticed her breathing quicken. He stepped closer, slowly, to avoid alarming her. "You're not safe out there alone," he said. His tone was steady, not demanding, simply factual. Mara swallowed hard. The memory of the foreman's grip still lingered on her skin, making her stomach tighten. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her voice wouldn't form the words she needed. Before she could answer, the sound of boots scraping against gravel reached them. Elias turned his head slightly. The foreman rounded the corner, his face tight with anger, his jaw clenched. He had tracked them after all. Mara's chest clenched. She stiffened, her fingers tightening around the shawl. Elias's posture changed instantly. He shifted 1 foot forward, positioning himself between her and the approaching man without appearing aggressive. The foreman stopped a few yards away, breathing hard. "You think you can walk off with her?" he snapped. "She belongs back where she was." Mara's pulse jumped. She stepped closer to Elias's side, not touching him, but moving into the space where she felt slightly shielded. Her fear pushed her toward a decision she had been avoiding since morning. She leaned in just enough for him to hear her whisper, "Do it, but someone might see." She didn't mean violence. She meant, stand between us again, even if the town watches, even if it causes trouble. For her, asking was a heavy choice. Asking made the danger real. But she no longer had time to weigh every fear. Elias didn't take his eyes off the foreman. He absorbed her words quietly. He understood them. She needed someone to intervene without making a spectacle, someone who wouldn't escalate the situation beyond control. He had done it before in other towns, for other people, though never with this much hesitation. Trouble usually followed him, but this time, stepping back would leave her to a fate she clearly could not face alone. "I'm not going to let him near you," he said under his breath, steady and certain. The foreman moved in again, anger growing. "You don't even know her," he said. "You don't know what kind of—" Elias cut him off by lifting one hand in a clear, control motion. Stop. The single word carried enough authority to freeze the foreman mid-step. Elias did not raise his voice, but something in the tone, calm, grounded, unshakable, made refusal difficult. You grabbed her in the street, Elias continued. It ends here. The foreman laughed once, sharp and mocking. You planning to fight me? No, Elias said, but you done putting hands on her. For a moment, neither man moved. The air between them tightened. Mara's breath caught as she watched the foreman's face shift, anger, disbelief, then a flicker of uncertainty. Elias's stance was too steady to provoke easily, and the foreman knew there were witnesses nearby. He wanted control, not a public confrontation he might lose. His eyes narrowed. This isn't over. Elias didn't answer. His lack of reaction frustrated the foreman more than anger would have. Eventually the man stepped back, pointing a finger at Mara. You think he'll save you next time? You're making a mistake. She said nothing. Her silence wasn't submission, it was exhaustion. The foreman finally turned and walked off, muttering to himself as he headed back toward the saloon. The moment he disappeared from view, Mara's knees weakened. She held the edge of a crate to steady herself. The shaking in her hands returned, harder this time, because the danger had been close enough to feel again. Elias looked at her carefully. You all right? She nodded, though she wasn't. Her ribs pulsed with pain, and her thoughts scattered. She didn't know whether to stay, flee, or collapse. She only knew she wasn't ready to face the road alone. Elias weighed the situation quickly. Leaving her now meant the foreman could catch her again within minutes. Keeping her here meant stepping deeper into something he knew nothing about. But stepping away wasn't an option anymore. There's a place outside town, he said. Quiet. No one goes there. We can head there until things settle. Mara hesitated. She didn't trust easily, but she trusted the danger she had just escaped even less. Elias's calm made the decision easier. Her legs trembled as she shifted her basket to her other arm. Show me, she said softly. Elias motioned for her to follow. They moved toward the ridge outside Red Mesa, keeping close to the back alleys to avoid prying eyes. Mara kept her distance, but stayed near enough that she could reach him if her fear grew too heavy. Neither knew what the next hours would bring, but both understood that the path ahead would bind them, whether they intended it or not. Elias guided Mara along the narrow back paths behind the livery, choosing routes that kept them hidden from windows and passing riders. He moved with quiet certainty, checking each corner before signaling her to follow. Mara stayed close enough to see the line of his shoulders, but kept a cautious distance, unsure how much she should rely on him. The pain under her shawl made her steps unsteady, and she pressed her elbow against her ribs to steady her breathing. They walked until the sound of town chatter faded behind them. Beyond the last row of buildings lay a stretch of open dirt road, broken fencing, and a few scattered trees. The ridge stood ahead, its slope leading to an abandoned barn Elias had seen during his ride-in. The place wasn't far, but it offered enough distance from Red Mesa to keep unwanted eyes away. Just before stepping onto the main dirt road, Mara hesitated. What if he follows? She asked quietly. He won't come this far right now, Elias said. Not after being watched. He kept his tone level, not promising anything he couldn't guarantee, but giving her a practical assessment she could cling to. Mara absorbed his words with a slow nod. She didn't trust safety as a permanent state, but she believed he was doing what he could. Her nerves eased enough for her to continue walking. They reached the ridge after several minutes. The climb was shallow, but Mara's injuries made it feel longer. She tried not to show how much effort each step required, but Elias noticed her slowing pace. He stopped without commenting, letting her catch her breath, pretending to check the ground as if giving her an excuse to pause. She appreciated the silence. He helped without making her feel exposed. The abandoned barn came into view at the top of the slope. It was old, weather-worn, and missing a few boards, but it offered shade and privacy. Elias pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned softly. Dust drifted in the air, stirred by their movement. Inside, light filtered through gaps in the walls, creating clear visibility without drawing attention from outside. "This'll do," Elias said. He scanned the corners, making sure no one else had been there recently. Judging from the undisturbed dust, it hadn't been used in months. Mara stepped in carefully and let the basket down. The moment the weight left her hands, relief spread through her shoulders. She sat on a crate near the wall, holding her shawl in place. The quiet inside the barn felt different from the town. Less judgment, less noise, less danger. Still, her mind struggled to slow down. Elias knelt near her, leaving space so she wouldn't feel cornered. "Your ribs," he said. "You're guarding them." She looked away, her fingers tightening around the fabric. "It's nothing." He waited. She didn't continue. Her reluctance wasn't pride alone. It was fear of what he might think, fear of burdening someone, fear of reliving what had happened. "I can help clean the wounds," Elias said. "You shouldn't let them sit like that." Mara hesitated. No one had tended to her injuries since the assault. She had tried to hide them from the town, and even from herself. But now the throbbing pain made it clear she couldn't manage alone. She tugged the shawl aside, just enough for him to see the edge of the bruising. The discoloration was deep and uneven, spreading from her shoulder down toward her ribs. Elias's expression stayed steady. No shock, no judgment, only controlled concern. He took a small cloth from his supplies and dipped it into the water flask. "This might sting," he said. Mara braced herself. When the damp cloth touched her skin, she flinched, her breath catching sharply. Elias slowed his movement immediately, adjusting the pressure to something she could tolerate. He worked with careful precision, focusing on the task rather than her reaction so she wouldn't feel scrutinized. Mara forced herself to exhale. The pain eased little by little. Elias's calm presence settled her nerves more than she expected. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly, her voice strained. He paused only a moment. "You needed someone to step in." "That's simple." "It usually is." His answer carried the weight of personal experience. He had intervened before, in moments that cost him more than he wanted to remember. But he didn't speak of that, and she didn't push for more. When he finished cleaning the bruises, he stepped back to give her space. Mara drew the shawl over her shoulder again and tied it securely. The ache remained, but the raw sting had eased. "You should rest a while," Elias said. "Moving too much will make it worse." Mara nodded. She didn't feel safe enough to sleep, but she allowed herself to sit still. Her thoughts circled one question she hadn't asked aloud. What now? She had no home left, no protection, and no plan for the next day, much less the next week. Elias noticed the uncertainty in her expression. "Who else knows where you live?" he asked. "No one," she answered. "I moved last month. I didn't want people coming by." He understood the reasoning. Distance from others meant fewer chances for trouble, but it also meant no one to turn to. The absence of family or allies explained why she endured everything alone, why fear had become a constant companion. "We'll figure something out," Elias said. His voice remained steady, giving her enough assurance to keep panic from rising again. He didn't promise a solution he didn't yet have, but he made it clear she wouldn't be abandoned. Outside, the sun shifted, lowering toward the western edge of the sky. The breeze through the barn boards carried the dry scent of the desert, and for the first time all day, Mara's breathing settled into a calm rhythm. She watched Elias as he set down his supplies and checked the door again. He wasn't restless, but he was alert, someone used to preparing for danger before it appeared. She found comfort in that steadiness, though she didn't say it aloud. Inside the quiet barn, both of them understood that the events of the day had already changed their paths. Neither knew where this new path led, but neither stepped away from it. Not anymore. The quiet inside the barn settled around them like a thick layer of stillness. Mara leaned her back against the rough wooden wall, holding the shawl tightly around her ribs. She let her breathing slow, but her mind refused to rest. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the foreman's face, the grip on her arm, the shame of being watched by the entire street. She kept her eyes open, focused on the dust drifting in the beams of afternoon light. Elias moved across the barn, checking each loose board and the gaps near the roof. He wasn't expecting anyone to follow, but caution kept him alert. He had learned to assume danger came when a person thought they were safe. After a quick look outside, He closed the door again and slid a plank of wood across it. It wouldn't stop anyone determined to enter, but it prevented sudden intrusions. Mara watched him do it and felt a subtle sense of relief. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. She shifted, wincing as her ribs protested. Elias noticed. "You should stay still," he said. "The bruising runs deep." Mara nodded. Her injuries were worse than she had admitted, to him and to herself. She didn't know how long they would take to heal or what she would do while she recovered. Her life had become a day-by-day struggle since she lost her husband years earlier and left her tribe to survive on her own. She never wanted to rely on strangers again, but now she had no choice. Elias unpacked a few items from his saddlebag, a small flask, a folded blanket, and dried meat. He placed the blanket beside her without saying anything. Mara hesitated before pulling it over her legs. It wasn't warmth she needed. It was the unexpected feeling of being looked after. "What were you doing in town today?" Elias asked. His question wasn't probing, it was practical. He needed to understand her situation if he was going to keep her safe for the afternoon. "I went for flour," she said, "and a little salt. I thought if I went early, no one would notice me." Her voice grew thin. "I was wrong." Elias took in the information slowly. She had no stable home, minimal supplies, no allies in Red Mesa, and a violent threat following her. He realized she'd been surviving by staying invisible. But the moment the foreman targeted her, invisibility stopped being enough. "You have anywhere safe to go after this?" he asked. "No," Mara lowered her eyes. "Not anymore." He nodded, not surprised. The look of isolation she carried made sense now. Everything she had relied on had been stripped away: people, community, home. She was living on instinct alone. "We'll stay here until the sun drops," Elias said. "He won't be looking this far out by then." Mara's shoulders relaxed slightly at the plan. She didn't want to think beyond the next hour. Her body hurt too much for long-term decisions. Elias's grounded tone helped quiet some of the panic that had followed her since morning. As the afternoon stretched on, the temperature inside the barn cooled. Mara tried to clean her own arm with the cloth Elias had used earlier, but her hand shook and she struggled to reach the worst of the bruising. Elias stopped her gently. "Let me," he said. She handed him the cloth, slowly. Trusting anyone made her uneasy, but she needed the help. Elias dipped the cloth into the remaining water and crouched beside her. This time, she braced herself less, allowing his careful movements to guide the work. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He focused on easing the dry blood around her shoulder and the swelling along her ribs. Mara felt the tension slowly drain from her body. His hands were steady, not invasive, and his attention stayed strictly on the task. Not on her vulnerability, not on her appearance, not on the implications of being alone together. It struck her how rare that kind of respect had become in her life. Elias pulled back when he finished and returned the cloth to his supplies. "How long has he been troubling you?" he asked. "Since last week," Mara said. Her voice dipped, but she forced herself to continue. "He started visiting where I sleep. I tried to avoid him. Last night, he forced his way in." Her fingers tightened at the memory. "People don't help women like me. They look away." Elias listened without interrupting. Her explanation filled in the unspoken details he had already suspected. Red Mesa was too small and too divided for justice to be given to someone like her. She had survived by staying silent and small, but once the foreman marked her as vulnerable, the silence only made him bolder. "He won't touch you again," Elias said quietly. His tone wasn't loud or dramatic. It was solid, a decision made without hesitation. Mara studied him, trying to understand why he cared. He didn't know her. He had no obligation to her. Yet he stepped into danger for her twice in one day. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Elias looked down at his hands, thinking for a moment. "Because you needed someone who wouldn't look away." Mara absorbed that. She didn't fully understand him yet, but she believed the sincerity in his words. Outside, the sky shifted into the late afternoon gold that signaled approaching dusk. Elias moved toward the door again, watching the ridge below. The foreman didn't appear. No riders approached. The town was still. "You can rest now," he said. "We'll stay here until dark." Mara lowered her head and closed her eyes, not sleeping, but allowing herself to breathe without fear. Elias took a seat a few feet away, leaning his back against a support beam, his hand resting near his holster out of habit rather than threat. For the first time since the assault, Mara felt the possibility of safety. Not certainty, not trust, but the first fragile step towards something she hadn't felt in years. The sense that she wasn't entirely alone. As evening settled over the ridge, the space between them remained quiet, steady, and unspokenly shared. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the barn darkened until only thin bands of evening light slipped through the cracks in the boards. Elias worked quietly, gathering a small pile of dried wood pieces that had been abandoned near the back wall. He struck a flame and built a modest fire in the center of the barn, keeping it low so the glow wouldn't leak through the gaps enough to be seen from the town. Mara shifted closer to the warmth, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The heat eased the stiffness in her ribs, but the ache remained. She watched Elias arrange a few more pieces of wood, noticing the controlled movement of a man used to surviving in rough conditions. His calm gave her a sense of stability she had not felt in days. The fire crackled softly. Mara stared into it, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. She wasn't sure how much she should tell him, but the silence inside the barn felt too heavy to ignore, and the steady presence across from her made the weight in her chest loosen. "When my husband died," she said quietly, "I left the village. His family wanted to raise me with them, but I couldn't stay. They blamed me for surviving when he didn't." She hesitated, swallowing the bitterness of old memories. "I thought maybe people here would let me live quietly." Elias listened without shifting his gaze. He didn't try to offer empty comfort or interrupt her with guesses. He simply allowed her to speak at her own pace. "I took work where I could. Cleaning, cooking, helping with small tasks. I never asked for more." Mara rubbed her thumb along the blanket's edge. "But no matter what I did, I was still the outsider. Still the widow. Still the one with no family behind her." She stopped there, unsure she should continue. Speaking too much made her feel exposed, but not speaking left her trapped in her own anxious thoughts. Elias fed one more stick in the fire and finally spoke. "You did what you had to do to stay alive." Mara looked at him. "And you? What are you running from?" Elias didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly, and he exhaled through his nose, the kind of breath that carried old weight. Mara thought he wouldn't tell her anything, but after a few quiet moments, he rested his elbows on his knees and looked at the fire instead of her. "I used to work on a ranch near the border," he said. "Good land. Hard work. The only place that felt close to a home." He paused, steadying his voice. "One night, the ranch was raided. I tried to get the family out. I got 2 of them to the barn, but the smoke came too fast. I went back for the others." He shook his head once. "I didn't make it in time." Mara's chest tightened with understanding. "You blame yourself." "It doesn't change anything," Elias said. His tone wasn't cold, just worn. "After that, staying anywhere became difficult. People asked questions I didn't want to answer. So I kept moving." Mara absorbed this silently. She didn't push him for more. She saw enough in his steady posture and the heaviness behind his words to understand that he carried the kind of guilt that didn't fade. The fire cast shifting light across their faces. Mara watched him carefully. "You don't have to move on tonight," she said softly. "Not because of me." Elias studied her expression. She wasn't asking for protection. She wasn't demanding anything from him. She was simply acknowledging the strain on both of them, recognizing that neither had expected to rely on another person today. "You shouldn't go back to where you live," he said. "He'll return. He won't care if it's dark." Mara nodded. She had known this already, but hearing it aloud made the truth settle hard. The small shelter she stayed in was no longer safe. Staying there would only invite more danger. "I don't know where to go," she admitted. "I don't have anything left." Elias sat a little straighter. His decision formed quietly, the way all his choices did, solid, measured, without unnecessary words. "There's an old homestead past the ridge," he said. "Half used, but standing. I saw it when I rode in. We can stay there until things calm down." Mara's eyes widened slightly at the idea. "You'd come with me? Not leaving you out here alone." Elias said plainly. There was no hesitation in his voice, no reluctance, just a clear decision built from what he had witnessed and what he understood about danger and survival. Mara felt a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. She hadn't expected kindness from anyone, especially not from a stranger whose past carried its own shadows. Yet his presence steadied her. She didn't know what tomorrow held, but the thought of facing it with someone who understood loss made the fear easier to hold. The fire warmed the space between them. Outside, the last traces of daylight vanished behind the ridge. Mara adjusted the blanket and leaned her head lightly against the wall, exhausted but less afraid. Elias remained alert, listening for any movement outside the barn, but he allowed himself to relax enough to breathe steadily. The harshness of the day had eased, leaving behind something quieter, two people sitting in the same small circle of firelight, because survival left them no other honest path. They didn't speak again for a while. They didn't need to. The fire burned down to a low glow, leaving the barn wrapped in darkness except for the faint orange light brushing the floorboards. Mara shifted slightly, trying to relieve the pressure on her ribs. The blanket helped with the cold, but her body fought exhaustion and fear in equal measure. She kept her eyes on the dim flames while Elias listened to the quiet outside, alert to every distant sound of wind or shifting branches. The silence between them had settled into something steady, no longer tense or unfamiliar. Mara felt her heartbeat slowing from the panic that had controlled her earlier. Being away from town, away from the foreman, allowed her mind to consider possibilities she hadn't allowed herself in months. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked softly, not looking directly at Elias. He turned toward her, studying her expression in the dim firelight. She wasn't asking out of dependence. She was asking because her future had collapsed in a single day, and she needed something solid to hold on to. "We head out before sunrise," Elias said. "The homestead is a few miles past the ridge. It's quiet, enough walls standing to keep out the wind. We can make it livable." Mara nodded slowly. The thought of leaving Red Mesa tightened something in her chest, but not from reluctance. She had stayed in the town only because she had nowhere else to go. Now, with the danger there growing and no allies to rely on, the idea of leaving gave her a sense of direction, something she hadn't felt since her husband's death. "Will the foreman look for me?" she asked. Elias weighed the question carefully. "He might for a day or two," he said. "But men like him hate trouble that costs them more than they gain. Once we're out of sight, he'll turn his attention elsewhere." His answer wasn't meant to soothe her with false promises. It was a realistic assessment from someone who understood dangerous men. Mara appreciated that honesty. It allowed her to plan rather than hope. She took a slow breath. "I don't want him to find me again." "He won't," Elias said. His voice carried a quiet certainty. Not a boast, just a decision made by someone who intended to follow through. Mara studied him for a moment. The steadiness in his eyes told her he wasn't helping out of obligation or pity. He knew what it meant to carry a past that felt heavier than the years themselves. She sensed that, for reasons she didn't fully understand yet, he felt drawn to help her in a way he hadn't allowed himself to help anyone in a long time. Elias shifted his back against the beam and let out a quiet breath. His shoulders softened, though his senses remained alert. "You don't owe anyone in Red Mesa anything," he said. "They made it clear you're on your own. You deserve someplace where you're not watched or judged." The words struck Mara deeper than he knew. She lowered her gaze. "I used to think I could build something there," she murmured. "A quiet life. A safe one. But people saw me as someone who didn't belong. And when he came after me, no one stepped in." "You stepped in," she added after a moment, her voice wavering slightly. Elias didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to receiving acknowledgement for doing what he believed simply needed to be done. "You needed help," he said finally, "and I was there." Mara looked at him with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "You don't even know me." Elias met her eyes. "Enough to see you shouldn't have gone through this alone." Her chest tightened with unexpected emotion. She looked away quickly, not wanting to show how much his words affected her. Being seen without being judged was something she had rarely experienced. Outside, the wind shifted brushing against the barn boards. Elias stood, checking the cracks again. He noticed the tired slump of Mara's shoulders. "You should try to rest," he said. "We leave early." Mara hesitated. "And you?" "I'll keep watch for a while," he replied. "Then I'll rest in shifts. We'll be fine." She nodded. Knowing he would stay awake eased her mind enough to close her eyes for a moment. The fire's warmth relaxed her muscles, and although she didn't sleep deeply, she drifted into a lighter, calmer state than she had felt in weeks. Elias watched her quietly. The strength she carried beneath her fear struck him more with each passing hour. She had endured pain, judgment, and isolation, yet she had not broken. He understood that kind of resilience. It was born from surviving too much. He thought of the ranch fire, the people he couldn't save, and the endless guilt that pushed him across miles of empty land. Helping Mara didn't erase any of that, but it felt like a step towards something he had forgotten how to reach: purpose. As the barn settled into deeper silence, Elias allowed himself a rare moment of clarity. He wasn't staying in Red Mesa. He wasn't drifting to another nameless town. He was choosing the homestead, choosing to walk beside someone who needed steadiness as much as he needed direction. When Mara's breathing grew slow and even, Elias sat near the fire, watching the door and listening to the night. By dawn, they would leave the ridge behind, not because they were running, but because both of them, for the first time in a long while, had a reason to move toward something better. The first light of dawn seeped into the barn through the thin cracks in the boards. Elias rose quietly, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. Mara stirred beneath the blanket, her breathing steady but shallow, the signs of a woman waking with pain before her eyes even opened. When she sat up, she winced, holding her side. Elias watched her carefully, making sure she wasn't hiding anything more serious than bruising. "We should head out soon," he said, "before the town wakes." Mara nodded. The thought of leaving Red Mesa filled her with tension, but it also offered the only path towards safety. She gathered her few belongings, tying the shawl securely around her shoulders. Her ribs hurt with every movement, but she pushed through, determined to walk. They stepped out into the cold morning air. The ridge behind them caught the rising light, turning the landscape into muted shades of gold and brown. Their footsteps crunched softly along the dirt path as they approached the edges of town. Elias kept Mara close, scanning the area as they moved, listening for anything out of place. When they reached the first row of buildings, Elias slowed. The main street was already awake, earlier than usual. A few townspeople gathered outside the saloon, their voices low, their attention fixed on something near the entrance. Mara tensed immediately, her breath tightening. Elias guided her into the shade, next to a water barrel. "Stay behind me. Don't draw attention," he murmured. She nodded, gripping the basket against her chest. The crowd parted enough for Elias to see the foreman standing in the middle of the street with two ranch hands. His face was red with anger, and he gestured wildly toward the general store as he complained to anyone who would listen. He hadn't forgotten the humiliation from the day before, and the fact that the entire town witnessed it only fueled his frustration. Elias felt Mara stiffen behind him. She recognized the posture of a man, ready to reclaim control by force if necessary. Elias stepped to the side, blocking the foreman's view of her. "We can go around," Mara whispered. "No," Elias said quietly. "If he sees you running again, he'll follow. Better to end this while people are watching." Mara didn't like it, but she understood. A confrontation in front of witnesses meant fewer lies, fewer hidden threats, fewer chances for the foreman to twist the story later. Her pulse pounded in her throat as Elias stepped out from the shade and onto the open street. The foreman spotted him immediately. "You," he shouted, pointing in anger. "You think you can walk away after embarrassing me?" Elias didn't react to the insult. "You should leave it alone." "I'll leave nothing alone," the foreman growled. "She belongs to ranch property. She was hired to work there." Mara felt heat flush through her, fear and anger mixed. She moved closer, unable to stay silent. "I work for the ranch house. Not for you." The foreman turned on her instantly, his expression twisting. You were being given food and shelter. That means obedience. Elias stepped in front of her before she could take another breath. She owes you nothing, he said calmly. And she's not going back. The foreman motioned to the ranch hands. Take her. I'm done arguing. The two men approached, unsure but ready. Elias didn't reach for his gun. He knew that would escalate the situation. Instead, he raised a hand and spoke in a tone that cut through the growing tension. You're making a public claim over a woman who told you no. Think carefully before you take another step. The ranch hands hesitated. They glanced at the watching townspeople, people who remembered what happened yesterday. The whispers had already spread through Red Mesa. Many now understood the truth of what Mara had endured. The judgment that once fell on her had shifted, now directed toward the foreman. Several townsfolk stepped forward. A blacksmith shook his head. She said she doesn't want to go. Let her be. A storekeeper's wife added, You caused enough trouble yesterday. The pressure of public eyes turned the street into a quiet standoff. The foreman realized he was losing control again, but instead of backing down, he pushed harder. She's lying, he snapped. She asked for help. No. A ranch hand cut in softly. We saw the bruises. That wasn't help. The foreman glared at him, stunned by the betrayal. You ungrateful. Before he could finish, the ranch owner himself stepped out from the saloon doorway. His face was stern, his voice steady. I heard enough. The foreman froze. Even Elias stood straighter at the tone. The owner looked at Mara first, his expression apologetic in a restrained way. You were hired for housekeeping, nothing else. If my foreman acted outside that, then he acted alone. He turned to the foreman. Pack your things. You're finished. What? The foreman sputtered. You can't. You've shamed this ranch and endangered someone under our employment. You're dismissed. Effective immediately. Gasps and whispers spread across the street. The foreman stared at the owner, furious and cornered. His fist clenched, but he understood the consequences of pushing any further. He spit at the ground, shot Mara a final glare, and stormed down the street with the ranch hands following at a safe distance. Only when the foreman disappeared did Mara finally let out the breath she had been holding. Her legs weakened, and she reached for the edge of a hitching post to steady herself. Elias stayed beside her, ready to catch her if she faltered. You're safe now, he said quietly. He won't be back. Mara looked around at the townsfolk, some offering small nods, some avoiding her eyes, some simply relieved the confrontation had ended. She didn't know what to feel. Gratitude, fear, embarrassment, and relief tangled together inside her. She didn't trust the town, but she felt the shift in the air. People had finally seen the truth. Elias gently touched her elbow, guiding her out of the crowd. Let's go, he said. We have a place to reach. Mara nodded. The weight on her chest loosened. The danger that haunted her had been broken, not by running, but by a man who stood beside her without hesitation. They walked away from Red Mesa toward the ridge, leaving the town, the fear, and the past behind them. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was the first time in a long while that Mara felt the ground beneath her feet, leading somewhere worth following. The ridge opened into a quiet stretch of land where the remains of an old homestead stood against the wide sky. The structure was worn but intact. A small cabin with a sagging porch, a weathered corral, and an empty well that hadn't been used in years. Grass grew tall around the fence posts, and the wind carried the dry scent of untouched soil. To Mara, it felt distant from everything that hurt her. To Elias, it felt like a place that expected nothing from him. They stopped at the edge of the yard. Mara held the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She was exhausted, but the calmness of the land pressed gently against her nerves, giving her a sense of quiet she had not felt since before her husband's death. Elias walked ahead, testing the boards of the porch with his boot. They creaked but held. Inside, the cabin was dim and dusty. A wooden table leaned on one leg. A narrow bed frame sat in the corner without a mattress, and the walls showed gaps where daylight slipped through. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter. More importantly, it was far from the dangers of Red Mesa. This will work, Elias said, looking around. Not perfect, but fixable. Mara stepped inside slowly. It's more than I expected. Elias nodded. We can make it livable. he said without thinking, and Mara noticed. He wasn't offering temporary help. He was choosing to stay. That realization settled in her chest with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They began by clearing dust and debris. Mara moved cautiously, mindful of her ribs, while Elias handled the heavier work, lifting fallen planks, securing loose boards, and patching wall gaps with pieces of scrap what he found around the yard. He worked quietly, but not coldly. He simply focused, giving his attention to each task the same way he had given his attention to her safety. Mara found old blankets in a chest near the wall, dusty but usable after a good shake. She spread them across the bed frame, creating a resting place more comfortable than sleeping on bare boards. Her movements were slow but determined. She didn't want Elias doing everything alone. When she tried lifting a loose shutter, pain shot through her side. Elias stepped in immediately. "Stop," he said. "You're pushing too hard." "I can help," she insisted weakly. "You already are," he replied. "But your ribs need time." Mara lowered the shutter and stepped back. She wasn't used to someone noticing her limits, much less protecting them. It stirred something unfamiliar but steady inside her. As they worked, Elias kept glancing toward the horizon, checking for riders. Mara noticed. "You think he'll come?" she asked quietly. "No," Elias said. "Not after what happened. He won't risk the ranch owner exposing more of his actions." He paused, then added, "Still, I'd rather be prepared." His caution reassured her rather than frightened her. He wasn't expecting danger. He was simply used to keeping watch. It made her feel safer knowing he didn't rely on luck. By afternoon, they had cleared enough space for a small fire pit outside and a sleeping area inside. Mara prepared what little food they had, mostly dried meat and a bit of flour turned into coarse flatbread. She worked slowly but with growing confidence. Elias watched her hands, noticing their steadiness had returned. "You used to cook for your husband?" he asked gently. She nodded. "He liked simple meals. I learned enough to keep us fed." Elias didn't comment further. He didn't pry in her memories or ask about grief she wasn't ready to revisit. Mara appreciated that restraint deeply. They sat outside as the sun dipped low, eating in quiet companionship. The light turned golden across the land, casting long shadows from the corral posts. The silence between them was no longer filled with fear or uncertainty. It was the steady kind that came from working together, trusting each other without needing explanations. Mara wiped her hands on a cloth. "Why did you stop wandering?" she asked. Elias's gaze drifted across the open land. "Didn't feel like it was keeping me alive anymore. Just kept me tired." He paused. Today made things clearer. Some places ain't meant to be stayed in forever, but some things are worth stopping for. Mara looked down, unsure how to respond, but her heart tightened at his words. She hadn't expected him to say anything that honest. It wasn't a declaration. It was simply truth spoken by a man who rarely revealed his thoughts. The wind softened, brushing gently against her hair. Elias leaned back, elbows resting on his knees. "You belong somewhere you're not hunted or judged," he said. "And I'm tired of living without purpose." Mara lifted her eyes. "And this place? Is it enough for you?" He studied her for a moment. Her tired posture, her steady gaze, the strength she carried beneath the pain. "It can be," he said, "if we build it right." Mara felt a warmth spread through her chest, not from the fire, but from the quiet certainty in his voice. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future not shaped by running or hiding, but by building something slow and honest. As dusk settled over the land, Elias stood and checked the perimeter once more, his movements protective but not overbearing. Mara watched him, realizing she was no longer alone, not just in safety, but in direction. They returned to the cabin when the night deepened. Mara lay on the blankets she had prepared, her body finally relaxing. Elias sat near the door, keeping watch out of instinct, though with far more calm than the night before. Nothing chased them now. Nothing threatened them. The land outside was silent, steady, and waiting. And for the first time in years, both of them felt that staying, rather than surviving, might finally be possible. Morning sunlight filtered through the patched roof of the cabin, spreading a gentle brightness across the floor. Mara awoke slowly, feeling the stiffness in her ribs, but noticing, with cautious relief, the absence of fear pressing against her chest. She sat up and adjusted the blanket. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't listening for footsteps or voices coming toward her. The land outside was calm, quiet, and open. Elias stepped through the doorway, carrying a bucket of water he had retrieved from a nearby stream. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and the lines of fatigue on his face were lighter than the days before. "You slept longer today," he said. Mara nodded. "It was peaceful. That's how it should be," Elias replied. He set the bucket near the small table and began placing pieces of firewood beside the hearth. Mara rose slowly and helped arrange the space, careful not to strain her ribs. Her movements were steadier now, her breathing deeper. The bruises still hurt, but the fear that had layered over them was fading. Elias glanced at her. "Ribs any better?" "A little. Enough that I can move." "Good. You'll heal faster out here." Mara paused, letting her gaze drift across the interior of the cabin. The sunlight on the floorboards, the blankets she had arranged neatly, the small pile of supplies they'd organized the day before. These weren't signs of a temporary shelter. They were signs of a life being built step by cautious step. After breakfast, they walked the perimeter together. Elias checked the fence posts while Mara gathered small pieces of firewood and placed them in neat stacks. She worked slowly, stopping when pain tightened her side, but Elias didn't rush her. He moved at her pace, letting shared work shape the rhythm of the morning. "How long were you planning to stay before?" Mara asked, her voice soft. Elias considered the question. "Didn't plan much past a day at a time," he said. "Never saw a reason to. And now?" He looked around the clearing, at the cabin, at the open land behind them, and finally at her. "Now I do." The simplicity of the words settled over Mara like a warm, steady weight. She wasn't used to being chosen, not out of pity or obligation, but out of will. Elias wasn't offering protection alone. He was choosing a place to stand still after years of drifting. They spent the rest of the morning fixing the hinges on the cabin door and clearing weeds around the steps. Mara used a small tool to scrape away old roots, and Elias reinforced the wooden frame. Neither spoke much, but the quiet held a sense of cooperation and understanding. Every small task they completed together tied their lives more firmly to the land and to each other. When the sun reached its highest point, they rested under the shade of a mesquite tree near the corral. Mara leaned her back against the trunk, steadying her breath. Elias sat beside her, his hat tilted slightly forward. The silence was comfortable. "You could ride out tomorrow," Mara said, testing the thought aloud. "Start fresh somewhere else." "I could," Elias agreed. "You don't owe me anything." He turned his head toward her. "That's not why I'm here." Mara's hands tightened around the fabric of her shawl. "Then why stay?" Elias took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. Not dramatic, not poetic, just honest. "Because stopping somewhere only matters if there's someone worth stopping for," he said. "And I don't want to walk away from what we started here." Mara felt a warmth rise in her chest, one she wasn't sure she knew how to express. She had spent years expecting abandonment, first in grief, then in isolation, then in fear. Elias's steadiness felt unfamiliar, but deeply needed. She lowered her eyes, speaking quietly. "I don't want you to leave." "I won't," he replied. The certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. A long moment passed between them, shaped by understanding more than words. Mara didn't hide the small tremble in her breath. Elias didn't move closer, but he stayed beside her, solid, present, and patient. By late afternoon, they returned to the cabin. Mara prepared a simple meal, and Elias worked outside repairing the corral. The day unfolded like something ordinary, something stable. When dusk fell, they sat on the porch, watching the sky shift from gold to deep blue. Mara looked out at the land, stretching softly into the distance. "This place, it feels like the first quiet I've had in years." Elias nodded. "Quiet is good. Makes room for new things." She turned her head toward him. "What kind of things?" He met her gaze with a calm steadiness. "A life. if you want one here. Mara's throat tightened with emotion she had held back for too long. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure she could without her voice shaking. Finally, she spoke. "I'd like that." Elias didn't smile, but something gentle settled in his eyes. He reached out, slow enough for her to pull away if she wished, and placed his hand over hers. She didn't move. Her fingers folded around his with a quiet certainty. The moment wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was two people choosing a future neither had expected, but both needed. Night settled over the homestead. The air was cool, the stars sharp above them. The danger had passed. The past had loosened its hold. In the stillness of their shared silence, a new life began, steady, grounded, and theirs to build. The story closed not with escape or survival, but with a choice. To stay, to heal, and to walk forward together.